Hi, this is William Henderson,
And this is B. McGraw.
and this is the Unjerked Podcast. This is part 2 of our episode on whether we are worse off than we have been in the past. So let's get going. So next we're going to talk about ways in which we're worse off. And these start to kind of look like a lot of the Reddit comments I read. So
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah. So when you look at economics, so personal savings rate, it hovered around 10% in the 1960s and 70s, and now it's at 5%. So people in general are saving less money. We looked previously at, debt payments. People used to be more in debt and spend more of their money on financial obligations. But at the same time, people are also saving less money now. So it's a little hard to kind of understand why that difference exists. I think part of it is cost of some other, there's certain categories of areas that are I guess they're not financial obligations.
They are probably people are spending too much money on Funko Pops.
What's a Funko Pop?
I see them all the time at like GameStop type stores. It's like a doll type thing that are like collectibles.
All right. So next we're going to look at rental housing unaffordability. And this is from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. So it looks at share of renters who are cost burdened and severely burdened. So cost burden means you spend more than 30% of your income on housing. Severely cost burden means you spend more than half of your income on housing. I would say if you spend more than half of your income on housing, you're not in a great position. I'm just going to put that out there. Like you should, if you can do something about that, I would recommend doing something about that. So cost burdened, it was around 25% of all people were cost burdened in 1960. And then by 2000, it was around 39%. And then it's been steadily rising since then. Around 2010, it got up to 50%. And then now it's still at around 50%.
Wow.
And then severely burdened, it was around 10% in 1960, got all the way up to around 20% in 2000, got up to around maybe like 28% in 2010, and it's been in that range since then.
Huh.
So housing so it depends what scale you use. If you're talking like past 15 years, it's not that much of a change. But if you go all the way back to 1960, yes, people spent a lot less money on housing back then.
Interesting. Didn't we also mention that like the square footage and everything?
Yeah. So
has gone way up.
So we did an episode on housing, and one of the biggest reasons is simply that houses are bigger now. And I think that's a function of, there's laws that dictate the size of lots and the size of, that type of thing. And here's a good way to kind of put it. If you don't have any restrictions, generally speaking, it's more cost effective to build a duplex or multifamily unit, assuming there's enough demand in that given, place. And then eventually you reach a point, far enough from the city center where people start building single family homes. But if you make a law that basically says, for this given plot of land, it has to be a single family home. Well, the highest margins would be in the most fancy, biggest home for that given lot. And so people just build big houses. And so a lot of builders just build very large homes because of that.
Yep.
So yes, housing is less affordable than it used to be.
Well, was that like housing and rental or just renters? That graph looks like it was just renters.
So this was specific to renters, but I don't see...
I imagine people are spending more on housing too, for the people that are spending on housing, or like
I would imagine so. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then cost of education. So we did an entire episode on how much education costs.
Way up.
And that's gone up substantially. And then healthcare. So if you look at percentage of median income spent on premium, contribution, and deductible. So the premium is your monthly insurance payment, and then the deductible is sort of how much you spend if you have to go to the hospital. How much do you spend before insurance kicks in, basically?
Is this
And
just for the people with insurance? Because we did see that rate of people with insurance went up.
yes, this is for people with insurance.
Okay.
So in 2008, it was about 7.8% of your median income was spent on your deductibles and premium for healthcare. And then it peaked out at about 11.6% around 2017, and it's still in that range. So healthcare is getting more expensive. It absolutely is. And then when it comes to, so those are kind of the big economic trends. Yeah. So if you look at healthcare spending as a percentage of GDP, it's also been going up over time. Basically, total national health expenditures as percent of GDP. So 1970 it was about 7%, and now it's at 17%. So the country just collectively spends much more money on healthcare.
Wow.
We should do an episode on that.
Yeah. Yeah, we keep talking about that since we started doing this podcast.
So it seems like big ticket items are getting more expensive. Housing is more expensive. Healthcare is more expensive. Education is more expensive. A lot of small ticket items are cheaper now. We talked before, food is cheaper than it used to be. Transportation is cheaper than it used to be. A lot of consumer electronics are cheaper than they used to be. There's a pretty drastic reduction in cost when it comes to, computers are basically unaffordable back in the day unless you were a large institution. And now everyone has a computer. So a lot of small ticket items have gotten much cheaper over the years, but these big ticket items are more and more expensive. The reasoning, so it's usually a mix of demand subsidies and supply constraints. Yeah, so like I was saying, when you look at housing, that's largely supply constraints caused by zoning laws. When it comes to education, that's mostly demand subsidies caused by basically unlimited student loans, guaranteed student loans. When it comes to healthcare, we haven't done an episode on that yet, but it seems to be a mix of things. Part of it is supply constraints. There's a limited number. The federal government subsidizes residency slots, and that has basically not been going up for a long time. So there's not as many doctors as there could be. There's certificate of need laws that limit how many hospitals can be built. There's lack of price transparency, which oftentimes causes market failure. A lot of times you don't know what different things cost in healthcare. Until recently, it's been basically completely against the laws for the federal government to negotiate drug prices with pharmaceutical companies. And so there's a mix of things that cause healthcare to cost so much. Next, existential risks. So I don't have citations on these, but I think there's a pretty clear trend. So when it comes to climate change, before fossil fuels, there was no climate change. Well, there's always climate change, but there was no man-made climate change, other than like deforestation or whatever. So that just wasn't a concern, and now it is a concern.
It's starting to get a little bit more real. I mean, as the recording of this podcast, I just, witnessed Hurricane Helene go right by my city and destroy a bunch of stuff around me. And I think this was like the 7th or 8th Cat 4 or 5 hurricane that hit the US. And it's like in the last 5 or 10 years, when normally it would take like decades to get that many big hurricanes like that. Like, it's increasingly more storms like this.
Yeah, definitely. And then when it comes to pandemics, obviously COVID happened. I think because of how easily people can travel now, it's just so much easier for diseases to spread from place to place. Basically, a disease can spread throughout the entire planet in the span of like a day, just because of air travel. Whereas that wasn't really a thing back in the past.
It's kind of surprising it didn't spread as fast as it did, but it probably did, and that it was just harder to measure. Because
I would imagine, yeah.
It probably spread faster than we realized, because I feel like it was like a couple months where it was like kicking up in China, and then a month where it was really gearing up in Italy, and we were all hearing about it and getting ready for it, and then like all of a sudden it was here.
And then the next thing is demographic pyramids. So,
is this where we have too many old people in relation to young people?
Yeah. So obviously, you can't have the population grow forever because there's natural limits to how many people can live on Earth. But we're kind of seeing the opposite problem now, where there's a massive reduction in fertility, and a gradual shift is not a huge deal. If there's a gradual slowing of the growth of a population, but when you see a drastic shift, then you can have a situation where a massive percentage of the population in a given country is elderly people, and our current social safety nets don't have
they don't really work otherwise. Yeah, they don't work. Yeah,
the option is to either have elderly people continue to work into old age, or to have young people basically spend massive percentages of their income taken away by taxes, much more than now, to kind of subsidize the lives of older people. And I think the idea of taxing very young people at a very high rate to subsidize the lives of elderly people, I think that becomes problematic, because oftentimes, when that happens and life becomes unaffordable for younger people, they're like, well, I can't have children now. I can't.
Yeah, and it kind of makes the problem worse at that point.
Yeah, it makes the problem worse. Yeah, and oftentimes you have societies like those where disaffected young men proliferate, and that's causes all sorts of chaos. Either extreme political movements or crime or things like that. So I think that's a pretty significant problem we have to face. When it comes to technology, I think it's pretty obvious that, and again, no citation, but privacy is way worse now. Privacy issues are way worse now than they were in the past. It's just ridiculous how much information is basically collected by data brokers.
It's a lot.
I remember in the early stages of the sort of war on terror era, there's a huge controversy because the NSA was collecting like metadata on like phone calls or phone logs, like who was calling who, that type of thing. Yeah, it was a huge controversy, and now private companies collect data like that on a daily basis, and nobody cares. Like, it's pretty incredible the degree to which that paradigm has shifted. So there's this article. It says problematic social media use in adolescents and young adults, systematic review and meta-analysis. And it basically kind of looks at all these different papers that were written about, this particular problem. There's another paper, and this says social media in the post-truth world order, the global dynamics of disinformation. And this is not so much about mental health, but more about the spread of disinformation. But there's Jonathan Haidt, who writes a lot about mental health in the context of technology, and then Tristan Harris, who's a former Google employee, who also writes about a lot of these topics. They do a lot of work related to this, but I think it's according to Jonathan Haidt, I believe there's a pretty clear trend where once smartphones and social media took off, there was a massive increase in mental health issues, especially in teenage girls.
That's what everyone's measuring now.
So it's pretty much, I think it's pretty clear that social media causes a lot of mental health issues. Next, we're going to look at happiness. So this is the biggest area where I think we are worse off, interestingly enough. So this graph looks at the number of close friends. So this is from Statista, and it looks at the number of close friends that adults have in the US in 1990 versus 2021. So in 1990, 1/3 of all adults had more than 10 friends. In 2021, it's 13%. So it's basically less than half the number of people. And then on the opposite extreme, in 1990, 3% of adults had no friends. And in 2021, 12% of all adults had 0 friends. That's pretty stark.
Not to
I
brag, but I'm looking at my Facebook and I have 636 friends.
um
On my
but like
MySpace, I only have one friend, and it's Tom. Or who's the person that friends everyone?
that that was Tom, I think.
Okay, I
But
thought it
think
was
think
Tom.
about that. Like 1 in 10 adults in this country don't have any close friends.
It is really,
Any.
it is really sad, but like the loneliness epidemic is very real for a lot of people.
I just can't imagine just the toll that takes on people to have no one they can really confide in. Very problematic. And then there's a paper called U.S. Trends in Social Isolation, Social Engagement, and Companionship nationally by age, sex, race, ethnicity, family, income, and work hours, 2003 to 2020. So they look at a lot of data. This is interesting. So this looks at hours, so annual daily average in minutes of different types of social engagement. Do you want to look at gender first?
Okay, we can do gender first, yeah.
Okay. So back in 2003, men spent about 275 minutes alone per day, which is like 4 hours, and women spent 294 hour or minutes alone, which is about 5 hours.
Hmm.
Actually, quite surprised that back then
red is women.
red is women,
Okay,
and now in
that's a
2000,
lot more.
yeah, now in like I guess 2020 or so, 2021, men spend 340 hours a day alone.
That really
Or
shot up.
340 minutes a day alone, which is how many hours is that? That's
334 is like 5.5.
Yeah, it's about 5.5 hours. And then women, it's about 325 minutes. So there's been a massive uptick in the amount of time people spend alone. Household, family, social engagement, there's been a steady drop for both. Women spend much more time in family engagements, non-household family social engagements.
Yeah, that's like an hour more than men. That's kind of flat across time, though.
Yeah. Friend social engagement. This is, like there's a big drop in both.
Whoa, that is a huge drop.
Well, the axes are actually quite different. So this goes up to 65
I know,
minutes.
but even then that goes like an hour to 20 minutes.
Yeah,
that's a third of the time.
Yeah, so back in 2003, people spent an hour a day with friends, and now it's 20 minutes a day.
This isn't limiting it to like in-person hanging out, though, is it?
That's a good question.
Because some people do socially hang out like on Discord or something, and I think that counts.
Yeah.
But I would also believe it if it like that did get factored in here.
Yeah. Other social engagement, you see a similar trend. Companionship, you see a substantial drop. I mean, the x-axis starts at 170. So,
yeah.
But basically, men spend. I'm surprised there's a big gap if companionship usually entails opposite gender. But there's a big drop. It looks like
they're both down to about the same level, like the gap closed on companionship, it looks like.
Yeah. So people just across the board are spending a lot more time just by themselves during the day. There's a substantial drop in the amount of time you're with your friends, the amount of time you're with a companion, significant other, etc. You see, I'm probably going to skip the racial trends. There's, let's see. Racial.
I think you see a lot of the same stuff, but there's like gaps between different racial groups, it looks like.
Yeah. And then there's by age. This might be interesting. So
are the Zoomers struggling?
So blue is 15 to 24. So blue is the youngest people.
Okay, the Zoomers.
There's, I think it's pretty standard that like older people don't spend that much time with friends because they have families or, they live far away from their friends. But people used to, young people in high school and college used to spend a lot of time with friends, usually.
Oh, yeah.
2.5 hours a day with their friends. And now it's down to 40 minutes a day with their friends. So there's been a massive drop.
That's really low.
Spending time. And when you look at companionship, younger people used to spend more time with their significant others than with other groups. But now 65 plus is purple here. So people who are older than 65 actually spend more time with their partners now than young people do. So, these are interesting trends as well. And, it keeps going. But the point is, like, people are, more and more people are just kind of by themselves. They're not really socializing to the same degree. And that was what Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam was about. When you look at drug overdose deaths, so this is from the NIH, drug overdose deaths, facts and figures, and it says U.S. overdose deaths from 1999 to 2022. So there's been a steady increase. So it was about 20,000 in 1999. Now it's 107,000. So it's 5 times higher now than it was in 1999. A lot of that is driven by men. There's a lot of these are word graphs from this NPR article, Addiction in American History, 14 vivid graphs. Like, for example, prevalence of the word addicted in American English. It's been going up since 1960. It was much higher. It was high in the 1800s, got down to like a very low number in the 1940s and 50s, and it's been going up since then. Prevalence of alcohol in the English language has been going up, alcoholism, etc. Alcohol consumption per person in the U.S. So this one, it's, I would say it's kind of varied throughout the years. This one, it's not, I would say it was actually much higher in the 70s, much lower now. So there's not as much alcoholism, or there's not as much alcohol consumption compared to the 70s, but more than there were in the late 90s, etc. So overall, there's been a clear increase, especially in drug deaths, but various addiction-related issues. And then there's this long-term trends and deaths of despair. This is from the Joint Economic Committee. This is basically a U.S. Senate related article. And it talks about, various forms of alcohol-related, drug-related, suicide, etc. And deaths of despair across all categories have been going up sharply since 2000. Most of that is caused by drugs.
Yeah, it looks like it.
But yeah, there's a pretty clear increase. So, I think, and then the last, so that's kind of the, the sort of reduction in happiness. People are more alone, and there's more, death from like drugs and things like that. And then next, when we look at civil society, trust in institutions, so there's a pretty clear, there's this declines in trust in others and confidence in institutions among American adults in late adolescence, 1972 to 2012. And there's also another paper, 50 Years of Declining Confidence and Increasing Polarization in Trust in American Institutions. But basically, declines, let's see. So it says declines are partly the result of dissatisfaction with governmental and institutional accountability, but also the result of polarization in trust in institutions. So people in general trust institutions and society a lot less, which is, obviously if it's warranted, then you have no choice but to trust. But it's not societies tend to function poorly when people don't trust in them.
Yeah, I don't think it functions much at all if you don't have a lot of trust. I've been getting into a lot of Reddit arguments about that I always mean to not do, and then it happens.
So when you look at the ways we're worse off, so, big ticket items are more expensive now. There's more existential risks, technology-enabled mental health issues, and people are a lot less happy. And this I think is the most important one. People just don't have as many connections. They have fewer friends. They don't spend as much time with their friends. There's a lot more substance abuse in society. Those things are very, very real. Bowling Alone talks about a lot of the causes of this. Part of it, frankly, is just, people in the old days, I think people socialized just because they had nothing else to do. Your options were to like go to the library and check out a book or hang out with your friends. Like there was nothing else to do, before the internet and whatnot, and before TV. But now that you have all these technologically enabled forms of entertainment, I think it kind of makes it much, much easier to just be like, oh, I'll just kind of stay in and watch TV or whatever, watch a show, or browse Reddit or something. I think that's a big part of it. I think our urban design is I think suburban.
It's not conducive about it, especially suburbia. And even people
suburbia,
in the cities don't go out a lot. I noticed when I was living in the city.
So you wrote a lot of comments here. Do you want to go over them?
Oh, well, yes. Also, three things on the worse off. One, here's a question with the demographic pyramid. Do you think the reason behind the shift in the demographic pyramid and the drop in fertility is more adapting to social living and just having less kids, or adapting to modern living and having less kids? Or do you think it's like we've got too many plastics in us? Because that's something I hear a lot.
No, I don't believe it. The idea, I know like fertility, like actual biological fertility has become more of a problem, but I don't think the reason people are having fewer kids, I don't think it's because of that.
You don't think it's because of the plastics? You think it's more social?
Well, here's the thing. Like a lot of people, obviously there's people who struggle to have children. That's a thing that happens. But also a lot of people, they have children relatively quickly. They get married and then they have like 2 children and then they stop. And it's pretty obvious there that they were basically choosing to have 2 children. There's a lot of reasons. I think part of it is financial. In the old days when people lived on farms, children started working on the farms, when they were, I don't know, middle school age, basically. And so children started becoming economically productive relatively early on. And also children didn't cost that much because a lot of times, they usually didn't go to college back in the day. They either didn't even go to high school at all, or if they did, that's paid for by the government. So other than food and clothes, like there weren't that many expenses for children. But now it's very, very different. Now, for most, most people want their children to go to college, and, college is very, very expensive. So you have to, if you don't want your children to go into debt, you have to start saving for college basically as soon as they're born. And then your children don't, they're not productive when they're in high school, economically speaking. And then once they become adults and go out on their own, there's no real expectation of them to support their parents until, it changes once your parents are elderly. When your parents are in their 70s and whatnot, there's a general expectation that the children help take care of them. But, when your parents are in their 50s and, the children are in their 20s or whatever, for the most part, there's no real expectation for the children to financially help the parents. Yeah. Usually it's the other way around. So I think children have become, the financial calculus has shifted dramatically, which makes children much more expensive. Also, I think there's a lot of just lifestyle. I think people typically start having children once they kind of meet a lot of basic life milestones. Once their education's taken care of, they have a career set up, they're married, they're kind of settled into a city, and then they're like, all right, now let's have children. And that takes longer these days. A lot of times, there's a lot more education. People go to college, people go to grad school. Also there's a lot more just, I would say, there's also a lot more choice in terms of like who you end up with. In the old days, basically, it was like, hey, like you are from this religion, therefore you have to marry someone from that same religion. We picked out somebody for you. It was very like, or you lived in a small town and there were like five different men or women, and what you're basically, that was your choice of like who you would end up marrying. And now there's a lot more freedom in terms of who you can date and marry and whatnot. But that also, I think in some ways that also kind of delays things a lot.
Yeah.
Where you don't feel a pressure to the same degree.
Well, it's the staring at the aisle of cereal.
Yeah.
It's in terms in Devo terms, freedom of choice is what you got, but you want freedom from choice.
Also, having children is, for women, it's very, very detrimental to their careers.
Oh, huge.
Yeah, so I think when you have societies, that's a big thing in East Asia is basically there's still a traditional expectation of like you're either a career woman or you're a housewife. You can't be both. And so a lot of women, they're like, well, I like my career, so I'll just continue with my career. I don't want to become a housewife. And even in societies where that's not the case and you can do both, it still negatively impacts your lifetime earnings to have children. For a woman, not for a man. So for women especially, there's a pretty substantial financial hit. And so I think all of those factors kind of get into the mix. And then I also think like once you have a society, like let's say you live in a city and you have a bunch of friends and everybody, nobody has kids. They all live in like, one bedroom apartments. And I don't know. They live the sort of double income, no kid lifestyle. A lot of times it just kind of like, that just becomes the lifestyle. So those are a couple theories, those are a couple reasons. I don't think it's because of like microplastics or anything like that. So, what else?
Well, I was going to go into my personal theory that I've had cooking in my head today on why the trust in institution is so low right now.
Which is what?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of pretty obvious. It's like there's been enough big things that institutions have been wrong on in between. Like, so if you imagine like the big journalist as a censor, there are things that are going to slip through. You have false alarms and misdetections and things, but relative to most people doing journalism, they're probably the best. So when they do have false alarms, which one pet peeve I've always had is I think the media calls way too many things racist or sexist that aren't racist or sexist. Then as soon as there are things that are racist or sexist, people aren't going to pay attention. So I think they've had that type 1 error that's kind of dropped their trustfulness with people. But like the second that people stop trusting in media and journalism, then they have to do one of two things. They have to not trust anyone. And now like basically they're like kind of insulated from any information outside of their direct lives affecting them. But now they have like super low PD, but they also don't believe anything. And the other option is they go for the people that do detect all of the things and the Alex Joneses of the world. But if you detect a lot of things, then you're also going to have a higher false alarm rate. So now you're like detecting all the conspiracy theories. So it's like you either like become like distrustful of everything and all institutions, or you think all institutions are out to get you because you kind of end up going one of those two paths if you like kind of see the mainstream media as a noisy detector. Anyway,
yeah. So
I'm an engineer. I'm an engineer. That's how I see the world, as in type 1 and 2 error rates.
So when it comes to major flops, where the government or the media,
a lot of people have a lot of issues with COVID, but like people wanted information now, and they're like, respiratory, so probably wear masks.
But what I would have to say about that is like, was that not always how things worked? For example, the Spanish-American War, historical consensus is basically, so we went to war with Spain because the USS Maine, I believe, exploded, and the yellow journalism people basically said that Spain, blew up, sabotaged the ship. I believe most historians now say like, hey, that very well could have just been like,
easily.
Yeah, that was probably just
Gulf of Tonkin, another good example,
right? And when you go even before that, I don't know when, but like if you go back far enough, like the news wasn't a thing. You just like the leaders just did whatever they wanted.
Well, and the journalist defense on those big moments, like I think they were just going off of the information that they had because those were all like just what the government was telling everybody.
But
And like,
I don't
they
think
don't have their own classified sources of information.
But I don't think the government was like more benevolent, in the 1900s or 1800s or 1700s.
No.
I feel like there's always a mix. There's always the government doing good things and the government doing bad things. So I think a lot of the more recent stuff is just awareness from just reporting. I think a lot of it is just more awareness of what's happening. Back in like World War I, like the whole war, I mean, happened for the silliest reasons. Basically, it was just treaties.
Yeah.
It's like, oh well, we're allies with this person, so we have to go to war, and like millions and millions of people died because of like blind patriotism, basically.
Yeah.
But I think back then the government had enough of a monopoly on the sort of the narrative where people kind of just believe them.
Well, they literally like, what was it? Who's a socialist that was running for president but was in jail?
Eugene V. Debs.
Yeah, Eugene V. Debs. It was way worse back then.
Yeah. And also when it comes to alternative media, you mentioned Alex Jones. There's all sorts of podcasters, YouTube personalities, Twitter personalities. That whole world is a cesspool.
Well, that's kind of that's my big argument online when people just like don't trust anything from the media. Then I'm like, then where's your information coming from? And I'm just like, because if it's coming from these people, I'm gonna say that's less trustworthy.
Well, at the very minimum, so a big complaint about traditional CBS, ABC, etc., is that they're corporate media.
Yeah,
so they're part of
the
larger
biggest
corporations. And the larger corporations have various interests in protecting their profits. But at the very minimum, a publicly traded company, who their investors are. Who the largest shareholders are in a given company.
Yeah.
How they get their money.
This is also coming off of the news where we have found out that a certain amount of like podcasters and YouTubers have been secretly getting money from Russia, if not like bot help.
Yeah, but the thing, and that's a great example.
And that's something that just came into the news.
But I think that shows, in this new media world, like for any given personality, you have no idea where their money comes from.
Yeah, there's a lot less transparency with this.
You don't know anything about their financials. You don't know anything about their financials. Are they backed by a foreign government? Are they backed by a billionaire? Like oil, fracking billionaire? Like you have no idea.
Yeah.
And you also don't know, like what are their sources? Like traditional media, like they don't reveal their sources either. But I think there's a internal process. In terms of like making sure sources are vetted, et cetera, et cetera.
I think there's a lot more of a mechanism to like hold traditional media accountable. I mean,
yeah, but a lot of the new media, they'll say things. Well, a lot of times it's just like commentary. They'll just like read news headlines and throw their opinion in. But even when they like make claims about things, like they have no real journalistic standard that they have to follow because they're not part of an actual news organization.
Yeah.
So I think that whole world is, which is too bad because I used to like, there are a lot of podcasters I really like that.
I still listen. I still listen to a lot of them. Like I still listen to Joe Rogan.
I think a lot of I don't know, across the I'm shocked at how many big personalities ended up being complete grifters.
Yeah, there's some people that are complete grifters in that process.
So,
but anyway, what else? Well, we can transition to the rest of the circle jerk arguments. Okay, first off, break from all of this. Oh, my last thing I was going to say is we should have done this in reverse order. We should have gone worse off to best off because that got depressing. Okay. So two, when I was looking up everything, I saw like an excellent comeback in this comment section. Someone, I think that post was something about like, is the UK better off now than it was 50 years ago? And someone comments, who thinks Britain in the 70s is better than today? We were the sick man of Europe. And then someone comments, well, now you guys are just the sick man, which is excellent Brexit comeback. Okay, well, here's some circle jerk arguments. Here's a circle jerk argument for why we are better off, that you've probably heard. It's the well, with all of modern amenities and everything, between YouTube, electricity, running water, basically no, at least most people are not starving in first world countries. Everyone's basically living a better quality of life than like medieval kings.
I think that's true.
If you're looking at like Maslow's the hierarchy of needs, which one is that one?
Maslow, I think.
Maslow. Is it Maslow? I think it's Maslow. Anyway, yeah. If you're going like hierarchy of needs, like the bottom rungs are like pretty well covered in first world countries, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think better quality of life than kings in the medieval ages. That's completely true. I think that's a very valid point.
All right, here's some mixed circle jerk arguments. It only looks bad because of the news. Like, if it wasn't for the 24-hour news cycle and you were just focused on your hometown, like, probably wouldn't be that bad. One of my personal circle jerk takes is that happiness is more of a personality trait than a condition. Like, given like a certain amount of conditions met, like you're not living in poverty.
Well, I certainly think people, I think the biggest thing that people have control over is their internal mindset and how they react to situations. And it's very difficult, the way you think is something that happens in your head. So you don't really know how other people think. And there's certain people who like their reaction to anything ever happening is just anger and rage and just, feeling like they're, screwed over by the world. So I do think, I think certain people are just happier than other people.
I think some level of that's a little undeniable.
Yeah.
Kind of similar vein. I think some people can make the argument that like with the idea of a hedonistic treadmill, like as soon as you adapt to like the convenience and niceties of modern society, like it's always going to feel about the same. But that kind of goes into the like it's more of a personality trait than a condition.
Yeah, I think a lot of that applies to material things. When it comes to moving into a large luxurious apartment, it stops being fun after like a week, or even like living next to the beach, it gets old pretty quick. I don't think that applies to friendships. I think if you have a lot of if you have close relationships, friendships, family, etc., I don't think that I don't think that's something that just you get used to. I mean, you have to maintain those things, obviously, but I think those tend to be more fruitful over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think so. And they get better over time, for sure.
Yeah.
There are some things that, improve and some things, kind of stale out. One of the last of the mixed is, and I see this in Reddit comments, but I also think this is one of the main messages from the book of Ecclesiastes is life only feels really great when you're a child. Like you're rarely going to be as happy as you are when you're a kid, and then perceiving things getting worse as you get older just feel that way because adulthood sucks.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. I mean, I think everyone thinks the decade where they were young was like the best decade.
That's why I think like Hollywood, whenever they're doing a nostalgia movie or TV show, it's always like 30 years ago, because people like in their 30s and 40s are the highest paying demographic, and that's when their nostalgia decade is.
Well, and also like obviously, that decade feels better because you just played video games and had juice boxes and ate Lunchables. Like, yeah,
had those Capri Suns, man. Turned to Silver Surfer. I think that's like a thing, and I think one of the podcast, I think the podcast I was mentioning where they were talking about like measuring happiness, I think this one was Freakonomics recently. When you measure happiness by age, it's like highest when you're young, and then it goes down and then starts ticking up back in when you're 50s, it starts going back up. And then so like basically your two happiest times are when you're young and when you're really old. All right, so here's some doomer circle jerk arguments. Oh yeah, this is a classic one. Is 3,000 years ago, some dude invented agriculture, and now I have to learn how to do calculus. Which is basically the argument that it's just like life was a lot better when it was like more simple, and now modern living is just like impossible to wrestle with. Like love and romance is more complicated. Economically, it's more complicated. Like I'd rather just be farming or foraging for nuts and berries and killing deer than, sitting in on this 3-hour Zoom call. And I think you touched in on this, that socially and religiously, it used to be a lot more simple when we lived in homogenous religious cultures, which was true in some times and places in the past. And then
when it comes to
a lot of people pine for traditional lifestyles anyway.
Yeah, when it comes to agriculture, there's a book I read that talked about how like people's health actually went down after agriculture was introduced. So I mean, there's validity there, but at the same time, like nothing's stopping you from like going out into the forest and like becoming a hunter-gatherer.
It probably would be pretty easy to like buy a piece of property in the middle of nowhere and live. Like there's a whole show about it with the Doomsday Preppers. Like there really isn't anything stopping you from doing that.
For most people, I would say
and some people really like it. I always like watching that show alone, and some people like live off the land when they're not on the show, and they really enjoy it. So maybe if that works for you, you don't like complex modern living, like, yeah, there's nothing stopping you. There's like immense amount of Canadian Rockies out there that you can live in where no one else lives.
Next.
Well, group these two together. The climate is going to kill us all. Also, there's a lot of people talking about how, like, with pollution and the microplastics everywhere, that is slowly killing us. I've also heard that with, like, some people talking about how our agriculture is always, like, 50 years away from collapsing. That's
so when it
kind of close to, like, the existential dread with, like, nuclear wars. Like, there's a lot of anxiety about it, but it hasn't really... Like, climate, you could say, has started turning into a real thing with the increase in storms. But I don't know about the pollution just yet. Or, like, what when the it comes to climate effect is.
So, in terms of climate killing us all, there's pretty broad scientific consensus that climate change, worst case scenarios, would not be an extinction level event.
I don't think so either.
It would not kill all people.
That's kind of like where I live, is like, I don't think it's going to be bad, and I don't think anyone's going to do anything serious about climate until, like, something crazy happens to our own society. Like, everyone can't live in Phoenix anymore because it's too hot and there's no water. I think that's when people might actually start doing something about it.
Yeah.
I don't think it'll ever be an extinction level event.
It almost certainly would not be. It would be very disruptive, millions of migrants and people dying and stuff.
Yeah. But it might cause some wars and some
the idea wars. But the idea that everyone will die, I mean, it's just not going to happen.
That doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah.
And also, this is something within our control. Yes, the collective action problem exists, et cetera, but like, it is physically possible for our society to move to a post, much lower carbon emission society. Like that, there is a feasible path, technologically speaking, to get there. It's just a matter of political will.
Yeah.
And complaining about it and being a doomer about it isn't going to make things better.
No.
In terms of pollution, like, we're going to die from microplastics, or we're all slowly dying from obesity or chemicals. I mean, I showed you the data earlier. When you look at cancer rates adjusted for age, they're much lower than they used to be. When you look at even metabolic disease deaths, it's much lower than it used to be. So the data just doesn't support that. Could microplastics secretly lead to massive increases in cancer, 50 years from now? I mean, maybe. But at that point, that's basically a hypothetical.
Yeah.
And then
let's see here. Some people in the comments on some of those posts were like, the golden age was basically like 30 years ago, and it's just like we're at the plateau now. It's not getting any better, so this is it.
Right.
Which I think we saw some data tonight that might have suggested there was like that Renner's graph that kind of looked like it was plateauing, but bad. But some things looked like it was still getting better as far as like deaths and median income I don't know. A lot of people talking about American empire in decline and how we are way past our glory days. I think America's still kicking it.
Yeah.
Personally speaking.
Well, also, America's not an empire. I mean, we have a couple, we have Puerto Rico.
I kind of hate it when people call us an empire. Like, maybe you could call us a soft empire because we have so much global influence. But yeah, like, we do not have a lot of colonies. For a while, we had Philippines. Arguably, Hawaii could be its own country. But otherwise,
there
hasn't been a lot of that.
Empire, the literal definition of empire is having sovereignty over other territories with a different group of people who don't identify with the main country. Yes, we have Puerto Rico, we have
some Indian American colonies, arguably.
Yeah, the American Virgin Islands, etc. But on the whole, like, we don't have control over massive swaths of territory that are not our own. That's not really a thing. In terms of, yes, we do have much more influence than other countries when it comes to military power and economic power. Our share of GDP, of global GDP, has been going down steadily, but that's just compared to a baseline that happened after World War II, where the rest of the world was devastated, basically. Either, Europe and East Asia was basically destroyed by war, and then Latin America and Africa and the rest of Asia was just mired in poverty. So, yeah, of course, America had a massive percentage of global GDP because the rest of the world was just in a horrible place back then.
Yeah, everyone else just kind of catching up.
Yeah, the decline in American GDP as a global percentage of the economy, that's a function of other countries doing better than they did in the past, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah, and even with all of that, like, I think America today is like, when you're looking at like freedom and spending power, I don't think, and just like stability, I don't think a lot of countries come close right now.
Yeah, when you look at our dominance in terms of the currency system, most trade internationally happens with dollars. When you look at the amount of startup activity, the amount of innovation that happens in our country through startups, through university research, etc. When you look at, continued dominance in cultural impact, when you look at movies, music, etc., and just our geographic advantages, being separated by oceans on the left and right, being next to friendly countries, having a large water, Mississippi watershed, the East Coast being navigable. There's most of the East Coast is protected from the
coastline. Oh man.
Yeah, most of the East Coast is protected from the ocean by a series of like islands and other things like that. So there's just a massive advantage, and like as other countries become more powerful, obviously as a percentage of the world, the U.S. will go down. But I don't even remotely think our country's on the verge of collapse.
I don't think we're even close. I think we're still like doing really well comparatively, like in between lifestyle. Like, there's a reason why so many people want to come here. I just forgot how much I love my country. Obviously not biased at all.
And then
last two, I'll just do it at the same time because So some people say inequality is so bad we're going to have a revolution, and then I have a coworker that says that we have an impending debt crisis, and that's going to cause a revolution.
Well, so when it comes to inequality, it's obviously getting worse, but it's still not as bad as it was in the early 1900s, and we didn't have a revolution back then. And revolutions happen for a very specific, like there's there's that Revolutions podcast.
I love that podcast.
But basically there's like a specific set of criteria that typically happen before a revolution. Usually you have a very weak and ineffectual autocratic leader. So they're an autocrat, but they also, don't have the legitimacy of the sort of population. You usually have both the elites and the masses angry at that person. So, it's not just the masses or just the elites. It's both are angry at the leader. You usually have, substantial inflation and inequality. Oftentimes, accusations of foreign influence on the sovereign. So, whether that be Marie Antoinette being an Austrian, or, the spouse of the czar being a foreigner, that accusation. Oftentimes, it happens after a massive defeat in war, because if a country loses a war, it just destroys the credibility of the leader. In Russia, there was that massive loss to Japan during the Russo-Japanese War.
Yeah.
And that just like nuked the reputation of the czar. So there's like a very specific set of circumstances that lead to revolution. I just don't see that happening here.
I kind of don't either. Well, here's what I think is going to happen. I think like you might see like miniature ones where like a group of people that are really fed up, they take control of like a courthouse in some random ass county in Texas or something. But I don't see it being widespread.
Yeah.
I think also, our quality of life is too good.
A revolution is a very disruptive and destructive thing. It leads to, death and despair, and a lot of people who talk about revolution or talk about civil war, I'm like, do you really know what that entails? Are you really ready for like half of your family to get killed? Because that's what happens in revolutions.
Yep.
When it comes to the debt crisis, I do think the debt is a serious problem, especially now that the problem now is like the economy is growing. So hypothetically, the increased tax revenue should help with the debt, but that's not happening to the same degree. Interest rates are also higher. I think, though, well, first, you can always print your way out of debt, which does cause inflation, but like you can avoid default by inflating away your currency, which is not great, but it is a way to avoid default. And then number two, I think like eventually you reach I think conceptually speaking, fixing the debt problem is not that difficult. It's really a political issue. You do a combination of raising taxes and reducing spending. Most of the spending is on Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security.
I think the theory on what would cause it is it's all the gamesmanship around a shutdown and everything, and they do go past the point of defaulting on debt.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I think though, when you look at the interest rates that are charged, so when you look at interest rates, those are largely set by investors. So the bond market basically pays a certain price for different bonds in the world. And more volatile countries have higher interest rates to, compensate for the higher risk. So places like Argentina historically had quite high interest rates on their bonds because they've defaulted a ton, etc. And the U.S. has historically had incredibly low interest rates on their treasuries because investors collectively view U.S. treasuries as very, very safe investments. So the bond market just does not consider U.S. treasuries to be high risk. It just isn't. They just don't. And also, like, you have countries that have faced debt crises, like Argentina's faced a debt crisis. or several debt crises. And
Man,
a
I
lot of
keep
other
hearing that
countries.
Javier is killing it over there.
Well, yeah, it seems like things are getting better there for sure.
Yeah.
But historically, Argentina's had, a horrible problem with both inflation and defaults. And it's certainly impacted their growth as a country, but like they still exist. Like people still live their lives in they still live their lives in Argentina, and they kind of make it work. So I like it could cause disruptions, but I don't think it'll lead to collapse. People just like, for example, in Argentina, a lot of the economy was dollarized. So for big purchases, especially, people just use dollars. And so they just people found ways to like use other currencies, and people just managed to find ways to adjust. So I don't know. I mean, the debt's a problem.
But it's a manageable one.
It's a problem that we know the solution to: raise taxes and reduce, mostly, Medicare, Social Security, and Medicaid. That's basically how you fix that problem. So that kind of concludes this series. I think I would say I think we're better off than we were in the past.
I think on average we are, and I think the new problems that we're dealing with are like self-actualizing as a species type problems, like learning how to deal with living in a digital society or more complex living.
I think the human connection is the biggest.
Yeah. Like I think we have to learn how to like redevelop human connection. And
I think that's the biggest problem, because you have societies where people, are poor, but they're happy because they have very strong social bonds. And so I think this sort of reduction in social bonds, I think that's a massive, massive problem. Yeah. But it's also largely like, it's not like people are forced. It's not like someone shows up to your house with a gun and says like, hey, like if you go to the movies with your friends, I'm going to like shoot you. Like that. This is a collective decision we've all made as a society. We've all kind of decided I'd rather just stay in and not hang out with my friends. So yeah. It's kind of a self-imposed problem, I think.
Yeah, but dealing with these problems versus like the problems of 200 years ago, where we're just like, how do we grow enough food, or how do we live in a city without, dying of dysentery? Like, I think
I forgot. There's a book called The Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson, and it talks about a cholera outbreak that happened in London in the 1800s. And basically what happened was there was a well that was somehow cross-contaminated with the sewer system. And so a lot of people were drinking water. Yeah, water mixed with sewage.
It's like these are the problems that people used to deal with, and now...
But like in the span of a few weeks, something like 600 people in London died within like a 2 or 3 block radius.
What?
I mean, that's just unimaginable now. Imagine like your old apartment. Imagine like 2 apartments over, like 600 people died in like 3 weeks. Like
generally my argument though with like, I think it's always like getting better and still getting better is like, or the argument I was getting in with people the other day was like, everyone's like, oh, science is dead because of the replication crisis. You can't trust it at all. I'm like, I think science is like more reliable than it's ever been. And it's just like, we are just now realizing like the limitations of what we already have been doing. And now people are actually starting to address it. Like the post-replication crisis papers are like way better stats than I've ever seen. Like, I think people are really adapting to it. But, I don't think we'll ever run out of problems, but I think we're like solving more problems than we have. And then you find more problems, but that's just kind of life.
Yeah. Agreed. All right. That was the last episode on whether we're better or worse off. We will come back with a different topic next time.